As his administration intensifies efforts to bring an end to the devastating conflict in Ukraine, U.S. President Donald Trump has openly expressed his desire for China's involvement in mediating with Russia, a move that could reshape the geopolitical balance surrounding the war. Welcome viewers to my channel. Please subscribe, like my video and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next update. I'd like China to help us out with Russia, Trump said candidly aboard Air Force One, en route to Asia for a high-stakes diplomatic tour. His itinerary includes meetings with regional leaders, and most notably, a sit-down with Chinese President Xi Jinping in South Korea. The remark suggests that Trump hopes to enlist Beijing's influence over Moscow in pursuit of a long-elusive ceasefire in Eastern Europe. Yet, analysts caution that Trump's expectations may be overly optimistic. China has emerged as Russia's most critical strategic partner since the onset of the war in Ukraine. Beijing's economic ties and political backing have become a lifeline for Moscow amid crippling Western sanctions. Chinese imports of discounted Russian oil and continued trade in dual-use materials, products that can serve both civilian and military purposes, have drawn repeated accusations from Washington and its allies, though Beijing has consistently denied aiding Russia's war effort. Trump's appeal for Chinese cooperation follows a particularly bleak week for Kyiv. The United States recently declined to supply Ukraine with Tomahawk cruise missiles. European Union leaders postponed the release of frozen Russian assets meant to bolster Ukraine's defense, and renewed Russian airstrikes caused further civilian casualties. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky condemned the escalating attacks, urging Western nations not to waver in their support. No country should be left alone in the face of such evil, Zelensky wrote on Telegram, emphasizing that Ukraine's survival depends on continued global solidarity. The Trump administration has struggled to deliver on its pledge to end the war swiftly, a key promise from Trump's campaign trail. His August summit with Russian President Vladimir Putin, billed as a potential breakthrough, ended without measurable progress. In recent weeks, Trump has reportedly grown increasingly exasperated with Moscow's intransigence. "Every time I speak to Vladimir, I have good conversations and then they don't go anywhere," he admitted earlier this week, revealing his frustration with the stalemate. In a significant policy shift, Trump announced on Wednesday a new wave of sanctions targeting Russia's two largest oil companies, marking the first direct punitive measures against Moscow's energy sector by his administration. The move underscores Washington's attempt to ramp up pressure on the Kremlin, though Russia's government quickly dismissed the sanctions as ineffective, claiming its economy had become immune to Western restrictions. Economists, however, say the long-term impact could still prove substantial, as energy exports remain Russia's most vital source of revenue. Even as trade tensions continue to dominate U.S.-China relations, Trump indicated that his upcoming meeting with Xi would cover a far broader agenda. "We'll talk about everything," he said. "I'd like to see China help us out with Russia. I have a very good relationship with President Xi. Very good." Trump also suggested that Xi himself wants to see the war end, hinting at potential common ground despite the two nations' ongoing economic rivalry. Beijing's relationship with Moscow remains one of mutual convenience and calculated diplomacy. Xi and Putin have repeatedly described their countries' partnership as a friendship without limits, a phrase that has come to symbolize their shared opposition to Western dominance. For Russia, deepening trade with China, particularly in energy exports, has been crucial for offsetting losses caused by sanctions from Europe and the United States. Meanwhile, the situation on the ground in Ukraine continues to deteriorate. As Trump made his remarks aboard Air Force One, emergency workers were responding to another wave of Russian missile and drone strikes across multiple Ukrainian cities, including Kyiv. Several people were reported dead, and infrastructure damage once again plunged neighborhoods into darkness. Across the border, in Russia's Belgorod region, authorities ordered evacuations after a Ukrainian attack on a local reservoir damaged a nearby dam, raising fears of flooding in the area. Trump's pursuit of a diplomatic solution underscores both his desire to achieve a foreign policy victory and the mounting global urgency to halt a conflict that has claimed hundreds of thousands of lives, displaced millions, and redrawn the map of modern alliances. Whether China's involvement could genuinely tip the scales remains uncertain, but for Trump, whose presidency has been defined by a mix of confrontation and deal-making, it represents one of his most audacious gambles yet on the world stage. The sound of jet engines hummed steadily through the air as Air Force One cut across the clouds, carrying President Donald Trump on another mission that would test not only his diplomacy but the limits of global trust. It was late in the evening, and the cabin lights glowed softly, illuminating the faces of aides, advisors, and reporters who followed the president's every move. Trump sat near the window, his gaze fixed on the vast stretch of sky outside, his mind preoccupied not with the trade meetings or economic briefings that awaited him in Asia, but with the war that continued to rage in Ukraine, a war that had come to define much of his foreign policy struggle. He leaned forward and spoke to the small crowd of journalists gathered before him, his tone direct yet measured, carrying the weight of both frustration and hope. "I'd like China to help us out with Russia," he said simply. It was a line that would echo across the political landscape within hours, a statement both bold and fraught with risk. The idea of seeking Beijing's assistance to restrain Moscow was audacious, some would say naive, but Trump believed it was worth a try. For months, he had watched the war drag on, with every peace initiative collapsing under the weight of distrust and bloodshed. His earlier summit with Vladimir Putin had promised progress but yielded little beyond polite smiles and vague commitments. Every time he spoke with Putin, the conversations seemed promising, yet they always led to dead ends. Trump had grown weary of what he called the Russian dance, a cycle of dialogue without direction. Now, aboard his presidential aircraft as it soared toward Asia, he saw a new opportunity, a meeting with Chinese President Xi Jinping that could, in his mind, open a path toward resolution. "I have a very good relationship with President Xi," Trump continued, his words echoing through the cabin. "Very good. I'd like to see China help us out with Russia." It was not the first time he had expressed confidence in Xi's influence, but this time his tone carried more urgency. The war had reached a dangerous turning point. Ukraine's cities were once again under fire, with missiles striking residential buildings, power plants, and hospitals. The death toll was climbing, and Kyiv's pleas for stronger international support were becoming desperate. President Volodymyr Zelensky had taken to social media, lamenting the isolation of his people. "No country should be left alone in the face of such evil," he wrote on Telegram, his message both a cry for help and a rebuke to those who promised solidarity but offered hesitation. For Trump, the frustration was twofold. Not only had the US refused Ukraine's latest request for Tomahawk cruise missiles, but the European Union had also delayed its plan to release frozen Russian assets intended to help Kyiv's defense efforts. On top of that, his own attempts to pressure Moscow into negotiation had been met with defiance. The Kremlin, as confident as ever, brushed off the newest wave of American sanctions, this time aimed directly at its two largest oil companies, with a shrug. The Russian government claimed immunity from Western restrictions, even as its economy strained under the cumulative impact of years of isolation. Yet Trump knew that behind the bluster, Russia was feeling the squeeze, and he hoped that a coordinated push from both the US and China could create the leverage needed to bring Putin to the table. It was a gamble that few in Washington believed would work. China, after all, had become Russia's most critical lifeline since the war began. As Western nations turned away, Beijing stepped closer, purchasing Russian oil at steep discounts, supplying dual-use goods, and giving Moscow political cover at the United Nations. The relationship between Putin and Xi had been described as a friendship with no limits, and their frequent meetings symbolized an alliance built on mutual defiance of Western dominance. For Trump to ask China to rein in Russia seemed, at first glance, an act of contradiction. Yet in Trump's mind, that contradiction was exactly where his strategy found strength. He believed that Xi, despite his public loyalty to Putin, had his own interests at stake. A prolonged war in Europe destabilized markets, disrupted trade, and strained China's global image. Trump was convinced that Beijing wanted peace, not out of compassion, but out of pragmatism. As Air Force One cruised across the Pacific, the president's advisors huddled in the adjoining cabin, reviewing talking points and intelligence reports. They knew that Trump's meeting with Xi in South Korea would be dominated by trade disputes and technology restrictions, but they also knew that Trump planned to expand the conversation far beyond economics. "We're going to talk about everything," he had said earlier that day, a characteristic understatement for what was shaping up to be one of the most consequential diplomatic conversations of his presidency. In private, Trump had described his frustration with the current state of the war as unacceptable. The toll on global stability, energy prices, and American credibility weighed heavily on him. He had built his image as a dealmaker, a man who could broker peace where others failed, and yet the conflict in Ukraine continued to elude resolution. Each passing month brought more death, more displacement, more uncertainty.